So like all analyses, the settings have to be driven by your questions. What do you want to know? And if in some situations a decision maker asks a question, what's likely to happen? Another situation, a decision maker might ask the question, what's the potential for things to happen? Those are two different questions, and if what's likely to happen, if that's the main question facing the analyst, you can probably get away with a fewer number of actual simulations. So maybe a few hundred would even do. It may be just fine, because what's likely to happen means you're in the higher probability regions. If you're asking a question about what's the worst case, what's the worst thing I could see, or what's the potential for very bad things, you're probably going to need one way to use FSPro is you're going to need a large number of simulations. You're going to need 5,000, or you're going to need longer than that, because the sequence for fire behavior, it's not just the frequency of given factors, so dryness or wind, that matter. What matters is the sequence. You'll get it if you have sequence A, B, C, okay, meaning different weather conditions A, B, C. You'll get a different result with CBA or CAB, right? The sequence matters, and to get the rare sequence that produces extreme events, you need a large number of samples that are drawn randomly from the climatological record. Pro produces probability contours of fire movement, and if the analyst has run that with a sufficiently large number of simulations, then you should have the ability to precisely estimate low probability events. So if, on the contrary, if an analyst picks, say, 100 samples, 100 runs to do for a 14-day prediction, the lowest probability you'll ever see is 1 out of 100, right? That's the lowest. And chances are only one fire will have actually impacted each location where you have 1 out of 100, right? And so the difficulty with that is you're not accurately estimating the probability of that impact. If you picked 5,000 runs, for example, or 10,000 runs, then you're better estimating the lower probability, the rarer outcomes. So to answer the question about how do you interpret real fire progression relative to these probability contours, first you have to say, well, have I got a sufficiently large number of samples to estimate the rare occurrence? If the actual fire comes close or exceeds the lowest levels, the lowest probability contours, there's a couple of possibilities. One, that's totally legitimate, right? Because nothing in FSPro says when. The probability contours don't imply when the fire gets there. It's just that it does that sometime within the time frame of the simulation, so 14 days, for example. But on the other hand, if the fire grossly exceeds the calculations, you have to suspect that something else is going on. Maybe not. Maybe maybe some of the inputs are not useful, or the weather record isn't long enough to actually contain rare events that would produce an event like that. So, these are questions that the analyst has to go through. If you're using a weather station that only has 10 years of data in it, or maybe 5 years of records, do you see the kind of wind event, for example, that did push the fire so far? Do you see that in the weather record? And if you don't, well, FSPro is not going to know any more than the weather record. So it may be that you've done everything just fine. It's just that your weather record was too short to reflect an extreme event like that. So it's hard to say exactly what to do. If you don't have a long enough weather record, maybe the fuel conditions are mapped improperly, maybe there was some very, very unusual thing, maybe a very large fire whirl, right? Some of the behaviors fall outside of the assumptions and limitations of the individual models. And the whole point of FSPro is to allow variability in climatology to be portrayed in the fire behavior simulations out beyond the forecast period. So I think there's better ways to do the forecast. I think we could use gridded ensemble forecasts that are available now, and that's a fairly easy, achievable input or change, because you would get variation in the forecast rather than a single one that would be the same one for 3 days or whatever you use. But so that's why I say 7 days is probably a reasonable minimum. But I mean, you could do a 12.5-day simulation if you wanted to, if there was some reason to do it. But very long simulations, I'm not sure I see much value in it, because at the moment, this is the way I'm thinking about it, is that say you do a 30-day simulation or something longer. We've done those, it'll run. It's just that nobody is going to not do another analysis in that amount of time. There isn't anybody who's going to sit there for 30 days and not make a different decision, not have additional information available. If you did a 30-day simulation, all it would be used is to suggest potential, you know, in the most general sense, the potential for fire to do something. But I actually think humans could do that anyway without the model. You can look out into the distance, out in the future, and say, well, geez, you know, knowing the time of year and the kind of year we're in, you know, this thing has potential to do a lot in 30 days. I don't think those are terribly valuable. I don't think that we're making decisions 30 days out on most of these fires with only that information. We're going to be revisiting things in the future. Now, there's always a question that would come up where you'd say, well, 30-day analysis would be appropriate. I just haven't run into one. I don't think there's any hard and fast rules with respect to this. Again, it depends. Think about what goes into an FSPro or any kind of modeling scenario, for any model at all. You have a certain amount of information that you know right now, and you have a certain amount of information that's kind of forecasted, you can foresee. And you use all of that to produce some kind of assessment, some kind of prediction. If things change substantially and deviate from what you assumed, and if they're important, then I think you need to rerun your simulation. So if the fire makes a big run, you didn't have any information about that big run when you did the original simulation. And if it changes substantially the position of the fire, you didn't have that information before. It's not to say that your run wasn't accurate given what you had. It just, you have more information now, right? You'd be silly to play random numbers in the lottery if someone told you 3 numbers were going to be on there. That would be idiotic, and no one would do that. So here you have information. You've experienced it, you've seen how the fire is reacting to the fuels. You probably, if you're paying attention, have more information on calibration, the adequacy of the weather station, all sorts of factors, and you can probably do a better job in the future. But automatically rerunning things every couple days for no reason like that, what's the point? If no one's paying attention to the simulation and they're just rerunning it so that they have something with a more current date on it, I say that's kind of silly. It does not recognize any interaction among the fires, except that if all the fires are run in the same simulation, then they can merge. It won't burn the same area twice. You won't get overlapping probability contours from FSPro. But it doesn't represent fire interaction, so to speak, right? You don't get merging of smoke plumes or shading of one fire from the next by a smoke plume, things like this that can really happen. But you do get a merged probability field if you simulate all the fires at the same time. That said, it's probably appropriate to simulate all those fires at once if they have the same weather influences. And if they're all really large fires, that's unlikely, right? You're going to have fires that are maybe 10 miles away or more than that, and very likely a different weather station, if there is one, would be more appropriate for one fire versus another. And then you might argue that, well, we would need separate simulations to represent those effects, because there's no way to, in one simulation, to partition the landscape into different areas that have influences from separate weather stations.